Welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye, where I get to talk in depth with some of the most interesting contemporary photographers working today about their latest projects. I'm David Oresick, the Executive Director of Silver Eye Center for Photography. Silver Eye works to promote the power of contemporary photography as a fine art medium by creating original exhibitions, unique educational programming like this series, and through the lab at Silver Eye, a space for artists to learn, create, and connect. You can visit us online at silvereye.org to learn more about our programs and to find a helpful glossary for these conversations. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Tarrah Krajnak, an artist based in Claremont, California, where she is an associate professor of art at Pitzer College. Tarrah had a solo show at Silver Eye in 2017 that focused on work she had made about her birthplace of Lima, Peru, and her adoption to an American family shortly after in 1979. The conversation we had focuses on a recent shift in her work, where she has turned her attention to making work that is in dialogue with two of the old masters of American photography, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston. This was such a treat for me because Tarrah was gracious enough to open up about some new series that are still very much in process. This is the kind of generosity from artists that makes me love being a curator. We talk about the thin line between admiring and criticizing the heroes of the Western art canon, why her teaching practice is so influential for her artwork, and why she chose to put her own body back into her pictures after years of avoiding it. I also really want to encourage you to check out the show page for this conversation on our website to find links to some of Tarrah's videos that are related to this series and to hear her reading some of the full poems that are discussed in this conversation. Tarrah Krajnak, welcome to Studio Visits with Silver Eye.
Thanks, David.
You began making work in conversation with one of the most famous photographers of all time, with Ansel Adams. Why did you decide you wanted to make work in conversation with Ansel Adams? And I say in conversation, is that a good way to describe it?
I think so. I think I feel like I'm having a conversation with Ansel. We're on a first name basis now, me and Ansel.
Yeah.
No, I think it definitely came through teaching.
Mm-hmm.
When I was hired at Pitzer in 2013, they had just built a darkroom, which is very unusual for a program to have a brand new darkroom. And so when they did the hire, they really wanted me to teach analog. And at that time, I was working with film, working digitally. But when I was hired at Pitzer, I really had to think about, this is a really small liberal arts college, and how do I build a curriculum that starts in the darkroom? I started in the darkroom in the 90s, and it seemed like a really fun opportunity to be thinking about those things. I realized that, in teaching my students darkroom and having to teach the canonical history of the medium and just to be so engaged with darkroom photography, I started to think about how we teach the history of photography to the next generation of students. And then it made me think about how I learned the history of photography and how, my photo, I seriously had never had a woman as a professor until I got to graduate school. And so my photo professor at Ohio Wesleyan was very white, very male, and we still had a nude figure assignment. We still had, basically all that we looked at was these white male canonical figures. And I hadn't been introduced even to Cindy Sherman until, much later on. And so I was really, interested in how we teach the history of photography, and in thinking about, modernism and the fact that we always have to introduce this material. And is there any way to think about it and come about it from a different way? And I started working more in the darkroom, and I kind of fell in love with darkroom photography again through teaching it, and through thinking about how we teach the history of it, and thinking about how does my own body figure into this history as a woman of color, because there are so many things that I think are problematic about the ways that we understand these canonical figures. And so I wanted to think about that and insert my own body into this history in both a literal way, but also kind of metaphorically thinking about like, what does it mean when one does that?
That's really fascinating. And I've been thinking about a lot of these same things and in my own teaching, I was teaching the history of photography most semesters, and how do you teach Ansel and when, uh, you know, how do you teach photography? I always thought about the darkroom as having this great seductive power for students, because it is
Yeah,
such a
it's
beautiful
magical.
process, and it's fun, and it's like tactile, and you can.
It's communal. You have to be together. You have to all be kind of working together. I love it.
Mhm. Through that whole process, through your teaching and through your practice, where did you come out on your feelings about Ansel?
I recently bought the book by Rebecca Senth, Ansel, The Making of a Photographer. And I've been really interested now in memoir and how an artist becomes an artist, or how a
Hmm.
writer becomes a writer. So I was simultaneously reading Samuel Delany's memoir. He's a queer, Black science fiction writer. And then I was reading Ansel Adams. Kind of, it's very memoiristic because she really dug deep into his letters and his personal material. It's just the life of Ansel Adams, sort of how he grew up, the privilege that he was connected to, his family upbringing, his first encounters with Yosemite. And I just, and I was really, and I was also like thinking about, oh, how does like a Samuel Delany become a Samuel Delany, and how does an Ansel Adams become an Ansel Adams? And I was sort of like reading those two memoirs simultaneously, and I it's not like I feel that it's really important to think about work in the time that it's made, and then
Hmm.
also to revisit that work and think about how does the artist change over time? How do we see that work, and how does it shift? How does someone with my body or my identity or my upbringing, like what is my relationship to Ansel? Because my first introduction to Ansel was really like on coffee mugs.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about art, and I didn't grow up with any literature or art in my house. So
Hmm.
Ansel was really me thinking about, oh, here's this, I didn't even know like he was an artist. I just thought it was a picture of a mountain on a coffee mug. I mean, I didn't really understand the importance of Ansel till much later on. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I just find him really fascinating. Even though it's like that famous quote by Cartier-Bresson where it's like the world is going to pieces and Weston and Adams are photographing rocks. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
it's like we're in this global pandemic, and I'm like looking at these guys who were photographing rocks, and
Yeah.
and these canonical figures who have just been written about so much. But there's still, I think, room for thinking about these figures and thinking about them in a new way. I was just really attracted to all the material, and especially that book Examples, and just thinking about the way that it's sort of Ansel's greatest hits, like 40, the
Mm-hmm.
40 photographs, and the way that he writes about those photographs are so, I feel that his work is it's very poetic. But the way that he writes about the work is so technical. Thinking of myself also as a poet and thinking about how to write from Ansel's text, like what is it about the photographs that I find poetic, and where in the text, where in this very like technical language could you find the poetry?
Walk me through what is Examples and what did you do to it?
It's Ansel describing how he's older. I think it was published in 1980. I can't remember now, but it was towards the end of his life, and he's looking back at his career, and he's picking out 40 of his most famous photographs, and it's like the greatest hits of Ansel, and he then writes about the work, like when he took the shot, how he developed the film. Like, he talks a lot about his equipment, about luminance, and of course there's a lot of technical language, and then they're so tedious.
Yeah.
They're just, and I was like, who would read this now? Like, just I don't know, the language is so, but the photographs are really beautiful. And I put my name on there. I just wrote it in magic marker and put it on there. And then I started noticing that, when I moved to California in 2013, I honestly had never been out west. I grew up in the Midwest, and, in Cleveland, and I had never really I was never interested in landscape photography. I was interested in self-portraiture and women and the body and identity. And so, these guys just never interested me. But then when I moved out to California and I experienced going on this road trip and bringing my camera with me, and, I went to the Grand Canyon for the first time in my 30s, and I got it. Going to the Grand Canyon for the first time, or going to Zion in the middle of winter, and just what the fuck? I had no idea. I understand now why you do have this experience in nature. And, as silly as that sounds, it's just oh, I had no idea. And the desert, I had never been to the desert, and now I live in the desert.
And so for the examples project, you've gone sort of through page by page, and
Yes. Yeah. Going page by page, and then thinking for this, for example, this is the first one I started with. I think because I started with this image because what I was really interested in is thinking about, okay, what is it about, this is maybe Ansel's only portrait. And so I started with that one because it seemed like an anomaly. And what I was really attracted to was just her expression, her mouth, and youth. And it's it's a very odd photograph for Ansel. You look at the rest of the book and you're like, what is this doing in there? And so, and when he described taking it and just how he sat with the subject, and I was like, oh yeah, I have had this experience where it's the first time that I photographed with my Hasselblad, and I didn't know I mean, because Ansel is so controlled, in that, he treats the portrait subject in the same way that he treats the landscape. It's everything seems it's very controlled. It's very the light has to be perfect. Everything is so controlled. And I thought about how I actually work in a very opposite way than Ansel. I actually work in a very intuitive way. And, the way that I learned, I didn't even really understand f-stop and
right.
and shutter speed for a really long time, and I remember taking this photograph of my grandmother, and that's my grandmother in Coaldale, Pennsylvania in 2001. And I remember I was in graduate school. I just bought my first Hasselblad, my first camera. That was the first camera I have bought myself. And I put this extension tube on there, but now I know, but you can put it on in a way that you screw it up. You basically can't ever get it off. And I was like, oh my God, I just wrecked my lens, I don't know what I'm doing. So this extension tube was just stuck on my lens. I couldn't get it off. And I also didn't understand how to focus yet on the focusing screen. So I was like, oh, my grandma was just sitting there. And I just remember rocking back and forth. You know what I mean? And I was also trying to figure out what the heck is this strobe? Everyone's using these things called strobes, and I've never used them before. And it was kind of I was in graduate school, but I hadn't had a proper technical background yet. And so I had I always just said, yeah, I know that. Just pretend to know things, and then you just learn it by doing it, by teaching it.
Well, it's kind of a moment where Ansel's unrelenting technical mastery is rubbing up against your learning and improvisation. And
yes.
So tell me about the the redacting and the highlighting and
Yeah,
the treatment of the
so
text.
yeah, so I started to write my own photograph about my experience taking my photograph over Ansel's, and the connection between, like, this one is just the lips, the mouth, was sort of this visual connection to like what I remembered about like a significant portrait in my practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote the story of my grandmother, and then I was like, well, I'm gonna think about how can I write this using Ansel's words, like the story of my photograph through Ansel's words, but it will be a poem. It will be, a poem through his writing. And I just thought there's something so beautiful about the way that some of that technical language can hold double meaning.
I think this might be an interesting time for us to take a little pause so I can play one of the video pieces you made from this work. This is a recorded performance that you made, where you're actually erasing an Ansel Adams photograph. You're scrubbing away the Elizabeth Pavlik image with your own hair, with your hair dipped in coffee, a gesture that erases but also browns her skin. Also, I think a kind of a sly reference to Ansel Adams' famous Maxwell coffee cans. And while you're erasing this image, you're also reciting one of your found poems that you created through this kind of text redaction. So this one is titled Elizabeth Pavlik, Erasure, Coffee and Hair, from 2017.
Elizabeth Pavlik, Coaldale, Pennsylvania, 2001. One evening, I had my first and most significant strong conviction. The most effective photographic portrait is one that reveals a remarkable subject in a state of immensely desired, prolonged death. I made this photograph of her only to synthesize many impressions long since disappeared. The face is defined, light, carefully positioned at a passing expression. But it is rarely a complete portrait. I was impressed with the results, but many were not. It was thought by some to be negative.
Can you show us another example from your Ansel Adams 40 photographs project where your image responded to one of Ansel's images?
I think one of the best examples of that is actually in the sand dunes, where that experience, because I shot, is actually in the same location, but I remember being there, and I shot that in moonlight.
Mm. Oh, your photos shot in moonlight.
Yes, it's at
Wow.
night. And
Wow.
it's at moonlight, and there was no one there, and I just was so quiet. And I remember I had taken all these allergy pills, and I was kind of like dizzy. And, I mean, it's like
yeah.
Ansel's writing about, like, his tripod, and like, and I'm like, oh my God, all I remember about that photograph is the moonlight was incredible. I started like hallucinating from my allergy pills, because I thought those little tracks, insect tracks, like were like some kind of other creature. They started to look bigger, like than they actually were. Like I started to kind of trip out. And but then I looked, and I was like, oh my God, Ansel here, it's just like dunes are beautiful as weight, a folding star, thin legs sinking in sand. Like think that's so beautiful, and yet he's talking about a tripod, you know, but
Well,
the double meaning of that is actually like so incredibly related to the experience, this trippy experience that I actually had in that landscape.
I love this project so much because I think in some ways it reveals this mirror experience, right? There's
Yeah.
Ansel, who is so comfortable speaking technically and precisely and
Yes.
describing the materials and the processes and the methods, and obviously very challenged to become expressive or to
Hmm.
access a kind of emotional or kind of literary reading of his work. But obviously it's there, right? Like, you can't look at those pictures, at least I can't look at those pictures and not think that there's a spiritual, like a deeply spiritual person making those pictures, or deeply sort of connected to nature,
I know there is
connected to the
something
world.
about that I really responded to.
And
In
then there's you, right, telling the story
yeah.
about like you are so in touch with your poetics and your intuition, and a lot of qualities that I think get described as feminine qualities,
Yes, yeah.
and you're not coming, readily to the technical part, and you're kind of learning the technical part kind of the minute you need it is like when you learn it.
Yeah,
You're not
I know,
really
yeah.
interested
Yeah,
in
yeah. It's
learning in
seriously the
advance.
second I need it.
And it's like this kind of bizarre marriage of these two styles that I think lead to similar places. Maybe now is a good time to switch gears, because
Hmm.
you kind of you decided to extend this conversation with the masters of kind of
Hmm.
American mid-century photography, and next you began a conversation with Edward Weston.
Yes.
How did you decide, one, that you wanted to continue the conversation, and two, to go with Weston?
I wanted to, I mean, part of this is, you know, there's a whole other part of my practice where I was working with, my other work that's related to Peru and, family history and my relationship to 1979. And a lot of that work was really based on rephotographing archives and taking my body out of the work. And I started to think about like why I had consciously taken my body out of my work, and it was really because, just when you're young and you have these critiques of not the work but your body, like
Mm,
I just remember with that earlier work, mostly, people saying things like, well, you're pretty so it can't be critique, you're 20, you're 23, like what's, and I remember this being very gendered and very, like they're just looking at our bodies and making this judgment. And I remember just thinking like I want to just remove that and make
yeah.
work that's not at all like where I'm just only engaging with like archives. So I made that, for several years. It's like I was just doing these rephotographic projects where, I took my body out of the work. But, I turned 40 and I'm like, fuck that. Like, I'm not 25, my body is aging. My body is different than it was in my 20s. And I was really thinking about the nude figure. Like I got all these books by a lot of different photographers. Went to the library, and often like my projects start in the library, and I was like, I want to do something with these poses that I was doing in my 20s, but I want to think about them in a new way, and like, how can I do that? So I just went to the library, got out a bunch of like the nude of the 20th century, and nude figure, and how to photograph a nude. And I got Manuel Alvarez Bravo's book, and a lot of photographers I was just looking at. And I went and I took all the books to the studio, and I locked the door for a week, and I just like went back every day and I looked at the books, and then I took some nude photographs of myself. But then I was like, in every single like anthology of the nude, there was Weston. There were these
Mm-hmm.
iconic Weston works of Karis. Is that how you say it? But I watched this documentary and I was just, and then Weston's history and also Weston's connection to Adams. Like I really didn't intend in that week to do a Weston project, but I started
Yeah.
a Weston project. Weston's relationship with Karis, and then I started, reading more about his biography, his relationship with all these women, and also just the position of woman in his work. And I think in the documentary, Karis is in her 90s or
Oh, wow.
late
Yeah.
80s, and it's just her talking about how limited her options were in terms of just like her father wouldn't let her go to college, like, and just there was this man, and I was just fascinated with Karis, and also like Weston's relationship with all of these women like Tina Modotti, and just the other, like the earlier nudes too, the ones that are
Mm-hmm.
pictorialist. And I just got deep into a rabbit hole of looking at Weston nudes, and I was going back to the studio every day, and then I just was like, oh, I should reenact these. As a lot of my earlier work was like really thinking about this idea of like historical reenactment,
Mm-hmm.
like assuming a pose and what that means, except for I was in a bodysuit. And at first I thought, maybe these need to be in the bodysuit. But then I was like, no, I think they need to be nude. Like, I think I need to be nude in these photos. So, and it's funny, I was telling you before, I don't think of these as, nude photographs of me. Like, I'm assuming this other character, and which feels, very liberating to me. And I love that it's me. I mean, I think I titled them something like, it's, I'm both the master and the muse. Like
Yeah.
in these, I'm the photographer, but I'm also the nude figure. And so there's something like some kind of feedback loop again about like who's looking at who, and looking at my own body as a woman photographer, embodying this kind of the eloquent nude, or the modern eye. And so I just started thinking how many of these poses could it was actually very hard to do. I mean, I was in the studio with, I do them by myself. So it's just these mirrors, like I set up 2 mirrors. It's hard on that cement floor. And some of the poses were just impossible. And, they take a while to get. That's how, Weston really started. I'm still in the middle of Weston. So
I'm really grateful for you showing us this work that I know you're still working on, you're still in
yeah,
process with.
yeah.
You started talking about your roots in school and being a 23-year-old and making these self-portraits and kind of getting shit for it, but probably from a point that wasn't really fair and wasn't really, paying attention to the work. Do you think that conversation has changed?
Well, there's more. I think it's just more accepted now because like we have selfie culture.
Yeah.
Do like I was working in a like we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have, it was way before that. Even in
I
the
think
90s, it's like we were making those same images, but they were distributed differently. So, I mean, part of that critique, like, I mean, I've also had critiques that stayed with me where it's like men, prominent curators would come to my studio and say things like, oh, your work is overburdened with emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just, and a part of like the Ansel project as well is like, well, I used to just try to push that away, to try to make my work very cool, very like devoid of emotion. But, that's not the way it worked. I have emotional reactions to work. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. Like I have learned more to embrace, that idea of emotion, and I think that those critiques for young women can be really devastating and prevent you from making work, and I, as a woman, as a professor, like I don't ever, like I'm not the type of, I don't believe in tearing a student down. I
Hmm.
think wherever a student engages with photography in a way that they find meaningful and valuable, even if it's complete referential, it's like
Yeah,
everyone's
yeah.
referential. I mean, like this is my work right now. It's like I'm referencing, I'm, thinking about that, and it's like I think that's valuable work for an artist to have influences. And a lot of times my students are like, oh, I don't want to look at that because they think that there's some kind of, like they want to be original, and it's just like there is no, the idea of like authenticity is very important to them. And I just
Sure.
think, and somehow that's also like connected with originality and ideas about originality. And I just think, well, it's so important to know your history and to think about like where your work is coming from, and like what ancestors do you have, in the medium. And so, a lot of the I never discourage my students from taking self-portraits. Like if that's where they want to start,
Yeah.
like I think that's great. Like I just am like, okay, look at Francesca Woodman, look at, I mean, and all of us, I mean, we used to make fun of this like all in the 90s. It's like, oh, everyone wanted to be Francesca Woodman. like we all had like either a Nan Golden or Francesca Woodman stage,
Yeah.
And I think that's great. I'm like, oh, that's a good place to start,
I guess.
But also I think it's
Yeah.
the problem of history. Just the problem is that, Francesca Woodman died so young, and everyone is obsessed with her suicide, and that it's the same with Anna Mendieta or
Hmm.
Frida Kahlo, or it's like it's just so, we're so interested in women's trauma, and so that narrative, and it's so controlled by men, and
Hmm.
not really, they didn't have any real control over the way that their histories were written, in the way that Ansel and someone like, I would say, Walker Evans, who taught at Yale and you know literally wrote his own history.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's important to understand that as a young artist. And I kind of didn't for a really long time. And then when I realized that, it's like, these are the things that I talk about with my students. It's sort of like who is, you know, who gets to write their own history, and who, how is that important to our conversation? And to think about how we understand the canon. And again, like a lot of my work is so connected to the things that I think about as being a responsible educator.
What is uh going back to the Weston photographs you've made,
Mhm.
or the what do you think when when you look at them? What does it mean to you to see your body in these Weston poses?
Well, yeah, I feel like they're not. I don't think of them as me anymore. Like I think because I'm in the middle of this project and it just takes so long to like set them up and get them right. I see, like I like that my body looks so different from the body in the photograph. Like
Hmm.
I'm comparing it because it's a double. There's this compare and contrast, and like, who am I getting the pose, quote unquote, right?
Hmm.
I see like the imperfections in my body. I see the way that, I'm like a short brown person, like I can't get into some of the poses that, I'm, my body is not like a white dancer's body,
Hmm.
so, I see those discrepancies, and I like it. I like what I see. I like that there's this contrast, and that the pose isn't exactly right, and it's sort of, that it's hard to kind of like fit my body into those particular poses.
The other thing I was thinking about, seeing your body in these photographs, in the way you're talking about it. It does, you know, it's interesting to me. It's making me think about the kind of unsung work of a lot of these women who modeled for him, that they were, you know, I'm no Weston scholar, but from what I understand, they were almost collaborators with him, were collaborators with him,
Yes.
were performing, were like,
Yes.
were parts of this artwork that we think of as Weston's artwork, and it's not all his.
Right. I'm interested in that too, like how much, like the relationship between um a portrait subject and the photographer, and sort of drawing attention to that relationship. And especially with Karis, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about her writing
Yeah.
in relationship to a lot of his most famous images from his Guggenheim road trip. And you know, I love reading about Weston and that time period. And you know, his studio was here. Like, you know, a lot of these photographers and their relationship with the West again is really important. And so I'm here in some of the same, living in the same landscape, living in the same areas when I go on road trips, thinking about, oh, this is where, you know, Weston was with Karis when he made this photograph. And I quite like thinking about that history that is here, you know, in California.
Mm-hmm. Tarrah Krajnak, thank you so much for sharing this work with us.
Thank you for having me, David. That was really fun. Thank you.